have the...
Today we're talking about regulation of sanitation, in particular sorting out mandates for and accountability mechanisms. So let me talk you through what we're going to do. I'll start with a quick framing presentation, looking around the room and online. I think none of this will be news to you. Then we're going to get into a little bit more detail, looking at some of the findings from the Global Regulators Network called RegNet, led by Sam. Then we will go to ESOAS, the Eastern and Southern Africa Association for Regulators, and then to Latin America and Adirasa with a video from Oscar. We then a quick Q&A, so please save up your questions, and then we'll go into a panel discussion with a selection of these organisations who are working on regulation at country level or globally, and regulators themselves. So without further ado, I'll get into it. So hopefully you have seen this report now. I think it's our kind of framing way forward. G 6.2 and 6.3 by 2030. And I think we all know that's a really heavy lift. We're alarmingly off track at current rates of progress. It'll be the 22nd century before we achieve safely managed sanitation for all. So we really need to be thinking about new approaches. So, I think you would have heard this many times. These are the JMP graphics showing that the quadrupling of progress that we need to see to reach those targets. And of course, that's a global average, so the rates of change in the furthest behind countries is even higher. A major message from this that we really want to reinforce is that sanitation is a public good. I think one of the things that has possibly held us back is that for too long we've left the task of sanitation in the hands of households themselves or in the hands of businesses or entities. So we really need to redefine this as a fundamental public. And the change that we're advocating for is really thinking about professionally managed and regulated services. So, clearly we're talking as well about, the whole sanitation chain. So it's very clear when you look outside of the immediate household that households have very little control over what happens next. So hence the need for services and regulation for the whole chain. And then, particularly when we look at these as growth rates of on-site sanitation, we see that on-site sanitation is growing twice as fast as sewers in urban areas. So I think this really reinforces the need to not just make sure we're getting access to basic services, but coming in quickly behind with safely managed services. So within the report, I've painted a slightly depressing picture perhaps, but within the report we do look at kind of ways that we can accelerate. And the main these are a little kind of broad, I suppose, but we're using the global acceleration framework with these 5 accelerators of governance, financing, capacity development, data and information innovation to frame what needs to happen. And particularly, I want to touch on here on the roles under each of those for regulators. So clearly, with governance, we need to see well-balanced regulation across all steps of the sanitation chain. I think we'll hear later that in many cases we don't have regulators for all parts of the chain. Public financing. So we want to have regulators need to be playing a role in making sure that government investments are used really strategically to attract and optimise investments. And recognising that a lot of those investments come from households themselves. When it comes to capacity, it's really clear there's a need for more and more skilled workers across the sanitation chain, including within regulatory organisations themselves, as well as sanitation workers. When it comes to data, again, particularly for on-site sanitation, the JMP will tell you there's huge data gaps there, and regulators have a really important role in both building and aggregating those national data systems. And then finally, innovation. I think sometimes there's a concern that regulation can put a lid on innovation, but in fact, with good performance criteria based on risk, it can actually enable innovation and entrepreneurship. So just pivoting quickly now to the guidelines, I just wanted to let you know that these are there. There's in-depth information on maximising health benefits from sanitation systems, including definitions all the way along the chain. What do we mean by safely managed sanitation? And then getting to, I think, the most important thing is what are the regulatory mechanisms we can deploy. So you will see here a range of things, whether those are technical standards, utility regulation, occupational health and safety, licensing of service providers, and so forth. So over the last couple of years, we've been really trying to build up our work on sanitation regulation through the regulators network. And I think this, again, probably no surprises to anybody here, but we see there's huge gaps and overlaps in the mandates for regulation along the sanitation chain. We need to be thinking about, well, what are the accountability mechanisms and how do these regulations work together as a coherent set, thinking of that diagram I just showed. So quickly before I pass to Sam, just a quick descriptor of RegNet for those who may not be familiar with it. It's a global network of drinking water and sanitation regulators, increasingly trying to attract in sanitation regulators for the purpose of protecting public health. So we don't work so much on tariff regulation because that's not really WHO's core capacity. It works on peer-to-peer support and capacity development rather than a kind of a one-way training approach, because clearly there's huge differences in what works in different settings. So sharing of good practice and of course trying to support regulators to build up these national data and monitoring and accountability systems. So that's all from me. I hope that kind of sets you up a bit for the session. I'd like now to pass to Sam.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. Really exciting to be giving this presentation in person. It's the first time in 3 years I've been presenting in person, as well as to everyone online. So I'm Sam Jabble. I'm Head of Evaluation, Research and Learning with Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. I'm going to present essentially some emerging findings from a background paper that we are preparing for WHO, looking at responsibilities and accountability in RegNet member countries and the WHO European region. Emphasis on emerging, I should say, because this research really is at an early stage. But I think there are some useful insights to share. I think it's instructive, first of all, to take a step back and really reflect on the scale of the challenge in terms of what is involved in regulating sanitation. So to do this, I've drawn on the WHO sanitation guidelines as per Kate's presentation. So those guidelines include a really detailed breakdown of the aspects of sanitation that need to be regulated, looking across the sanitation chain. So we see economic aspects like tariffs, service quality regulation, public health like operational worker health and safety. And I think what becomes clear very quickly when we map regulation in this way is that designing regulatory frameworks and ensuring clarity of responsibility for who is regulating what at every step in the chain is just a huge challenge. And that's why this session and a lot of the work that is taking place in the sector now to support this area is so critically important. I also wanted to reinforce some findings from research that has been completed recently in this area, so specifically a set of papers led by ESOAS, the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association. So they commissioned research looking at responsibilities and accountability and resource planning and management around citywide inclusive sanitation specifically. But these principles, I think we're already seeing them reflected in the research we're undertaking now for RegNet, and I think we'll keep coming back to these as the session continues. So those SOAS papers showed, amongst wide-ranging findings, mandates must provide clarity on who is responsible for different elements of the sanitation service chain. That applies to regulation as well as to service provision. Accountability for on-site sanitation needs to be a central focus and should pay strong attention to containment. Strengthening transparency is fundamental for accountability and actually a relatively easy win. And we're talking there, for example, around benchmarking, public benchmarking of service provider performance. And regulatory authorities can play a critical leadership role in convening stakeholders to develop consensus. So we're looking now to build on that research, and in this RegNet paper we're trying to do three things. First of all, to map responsibilities for sanitation regulation across RegNet member countries and the WHO European region, to understand accountability mechanisms in those countries, and ultimately to highlight good practice, because this is really about peer-to-peer learning, providing a foundation for these countries to exchange good practice, including in the next RegNet annual meeting in Geneva in November. So that's what we're working towards. In terms of the data collection for this study, so this is a snapshot of the respondents that we've spoken to date. So it's wide-ranging geographically per the RegNet member base. So we've spoken with regulators in Eastern and Southern Africa. We've spoken with ministry officials in Western Africa, so Latin America, in Argentina. But importantly, also a number of countries where experience in this area, I think, is less well documented to date, but countries that are experiencing very real challenges around regulation and on-site sanitation specifically. So countries in Eastern Europe, for example, Romania, Moldova, Serbia, moving into the Caucasus, Georgia and Azerbaijan, and even Central Asia, Tajikistan, Finland in Northern Europe. So this is quite an interesting opportunity to look at regulatory challenges across regions and understand the extent to which principles apply. So, little formatting error there, but to start with, we're trying to understand who is responsible for regulating different elements of the sanitation service chain in these countries. Again, we're building on the methodology we used in the recent SOAS papers, where we mapped responsibilities for service provision, but here looking at regulation. And this work is ongoing, but we wanted to share just two examples by way of illustration. Palestine and Kenya, both countries that have strong active independent regulators, WSRC and WASREB. You see that those regulators are involved across all steps of the sanitation chain, sewered and on-site, but you also see a number of other authorities with important roles to play. For example, the Water Authority and the Water Resources Authority, respectively. At the containment stage, municipalities and county governments, respectively. NEMA, the National Environmental Management Authority in Kenya, has an important role to play across different elements of the on-site sanitation chain. And this is what we see reflected really across geographies. There are always, or generally, a large number of authorities with a role to play, and it's really a question of coordinating and ensuring that those responsibilities are complementary and not overlapping or creating a lack of clarity. The second thing that we're doing in this paper is looking to then map accountability mechanisms, again utilising the framework from the WHO sanitation guidelines. Again, this is an early stage, but just to pick out some examples, I mentioned benchmarking. A number of respondents that we've spoken to will highlight benchmarking really as a fundamental starting point, a regulatory tool. So WSRC in Palestine are moving into increasingly public benchmarking, ERAS in Argentina, and that has been replicated in Latin America, supported by ADARASA. Kenya and Zambia are really strong, well-documented examples of benchmarking. So the impact reports that WASREB produce in Kenya, as well as the annual reports that NOASCO produce in Zambia. Performance contracts, which can be between a ministry department and a service provider, but they can also be between the utility and a private sector provider. We're seeing this as an important accountability mechanism for holding private sector providers to account. For example, in Kenya, Senegal, Zambia. Standard operating procedures, when we're looking at occupational health and safety regulations, is a really important accountability mechanism. And licensing, again, licensing is just a fundamental regulatory tool. Kenya and Zambia, WASREB and NOASCO have used this very effectively, including actually to drive forward sector reforms by requiring licensed utilities to adapt their mandates and expand into on-site sanitation. So then to share some wider emerging findings, again caveated because this is at an early stage. So responsibilities, as I mentioned, generally divided across multiple ministries, agencies. So we have ministries of public health, environment, urban planning, water and sanitation, and so forth, all of whom generally have a role to play in regulation at some point in the sanitation chain. Regulation of industrial wastewater has emerged as really a key challenge, where in some cases responsibilities are just not clear in terms of regulation. One point I wanted to highlight is that across regions we see on-site sanitation is often considered outside the system, and it's effectively unregulated. And this is quite striking, including in the European region. So you have a number of countries such as Serbia, Moldova, Romania, or moving into the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, where you have 20 to 30% coverage of on-site sanitation. There's a particular challenge around regulating small-scale on-site sanitation systems. I've included this graphic from Finland because this is actually a good example of a clear framework around responsibilities for regulation, but even Finland actually has a challenge in enforcing treatment standards around small-scale on-site sanitation systems. And coming from that, there is a need for enhanced peer-to-peer learning, including in the European region. So bringing this to a close, just to share how then are some countries responding to what we see as these common challenges. And I just wanted to pick out some emerging case studies from interviews to date. So a really fascinating interview with ERAS in Buenos Aires, which I think is a very clear example of a regulator actually almost moving beyond their mandate and playing a wider facilitating role in capacity building, in this case of service providers. So spoke to Alejo Molinari from ERAS, who was noting how ERAS is engaging with municipalities to develop and apply minimum standards for on-site sanitation outside the network, build capacity of those municipalities. And I think this is quite a nice illustrative quote in terms of the role that the regulator can play in that facilitation. So from Alejo, we're educating in this area. As a regulator, we're not obliged to do this. It's our initiative, but the message to service providers is that it's your responsibility, but we as the regulator are here to help you. Data management, Kate mentioned in terms of the SDG accelerators. We very much see this strongly reflected across regions, including in the European region. There's a need for improved data management around, for example, on-site sanitation systems particularly. One example of a regulator that is really engaging with this substantially right now is WSRC in Palestine. They're collecting data. They've collected data so far from over 300 small-scale service providers. Finland is an example of really grappling with this challenge around small-scale on-site systems. They've developed regional guidance networks to provide support to households in selection of treatment systems. Every region has a network, and they actually engage in cross-regional peer-to-peer learning. And finally, Zambia. Zambia has been well documented, but rightly so, because it's such a clear, strong example of a regulator playing a leadership role, a critical coordinating role in developing consensus. And speaking with Peter Matali at NOASCO, he's very clear in terms of this, what is an important question, which we might come back to in the session. If we're looking at a roadmap or what steps to follow from a base point of unclear responsibilities for regulation towards clear regulatory frameworks, the first step there is beginning with a review of the legal framework and understanding who is responsible for what legally as of now, and then you have a platform to move forward and move towards clarity. And NOASCO have been very successful in that in Zambia. Okay, so just to close by recapping those messages that I featured from the SOAS research, we're seeing them reflected to a large extent in this ongoing research, and I think it's important to underline them again. The need for clarity, the need for improved accountability for on-site sanitation particularly, this point around strengthening transparency as such an impactful regulatory mechanism, public benchmarking, and the role that regulatory authorities can play where there are independent regulators. Of course, in many countries there are not, but they can play a critical leadership role in convening stakeholders and driving sector reform. Okay, may have gone a little bit over time there, but that's that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to call on Angela now from WASREB in Kenya to present the landscape findings from SOAS. Angela, please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, Kate. I'm Angela Kimani. I'm from WASREB, that is the regulator of water services in Kenya. And we are a member of SOAS. SOAS is the Regulators Association for the Eastern and Southern African region. I'm going to today share the findings of a landscape study that we conducted across Africa. It was basically a focus on the regulation mechanisms that are applied in the region. These are the contents of the presentation. And quickly diving in, ESAWAS carried out a study in the 5 regions in the African continent. And the objective was just to give us an overview of the status of water and sanitation regulation in the continent. We had the Northern African region, the Western African region, the Central African region, Eastern and the Southern African region. And this was consolidated into one report, but the individual reports are available. And we're going to share this in this presentation. And then just referring to what Sam has just presented, we had carried out, before this, we had carried out some study on responsibility, accountability, and resource planning on citywide inclusive sanitation. And this was the preliminary work before we did this other study. So this is the report that you can also access on the ESAWAS website. And basically the report was to just give us an overview of the status of regulation across Africa. We compared the different countries and the models that are applied. We were also interested in establishing the policy provisions and the legal backing for regulation on the 2 areas, that is water and sanitation. We explored the models that are used in the 54 countries that were assessed. Then, of course, we also looked at the existence and application of regulations. Because what we realized is that in some countries, we actually have the policies that are in place, but in terms of their implementation, we found different levels of implementation, as we're going to discuss in this presentation. Then, of course, we also assessed issues of autonomy of the regulators, and also any factors that enable regulation to be successful in these countries or has been constraining regulation. This is just a snapshot of the countries that were included in the study from the 5 regions. From our study, this is what we found out. Basically, the status of water and sanitation, water supply and sanitation in the continent. What we found out is that the services have improved over the last 2 decades, but you'll agree with me that we still have a long way to go, so we need to accelerate progress in this, in achieving SDG 6. Then again, the context, like you see, we looked at the 5 regions. They are just as diverse as the numbers. We actually found mixed findings depending on the regions, and sometimes we would find that disparities even within one region. Again, we had some challenges in some of the countries. The data was not up to date, but we can see that most of the countries have actually tried to keep up-to-date data, and this is an improving area. We also looked at their documentation, and then of course we found that there were different, the policy documents were different in terms of the strength of the regulation and also the actors that are responsible for in countries. This is a snapshot of the coverage situation. I must say that this is basic coverage. On the left, we have the water supply coverage in the continent. And we use the traffic colors. When you see the dark green, it is 90% and above, going all the way to the red. So the green is good, the yellow is in between, then of course the red is something to really worry about. So when you look at the continent, you can see there are some countries which are actually very high in the basic coverage for water, and some are still quite behind. And then you contrast the 2 maps on the left. We've used the same coding. You can see in some situations, in a few countries, we've been able to maintain the very good coverage. In some of the selected countries, you can see the dark green. But you can actually contrast and see that some of the countries which had acceptable levels of water supply coverage actually deteriorate when you look at the sanitation situation. So this is basically to show that sanitation is still lagging behind in as much as we've had progress in the water supply coverage. Then regarding the legal backing for the regulatory instruments that are applied by the different countries, this is just a summary to show whether the jurisdiction actually has given legal backing to the regulations in place, whether it's strong, moderate, or no legal backing. Still, we've used the traffic lights. Where we have the green, the policy instruments have strong legal backing, so it means they're enforceable and hopefully will lead to effectiveness. The yellow is the moderate backing, and the red is no legal backing. On the extreme left, we have the summary situation in the continent. You can look at the African context. We can see water supply. It's about 54% of the countries actually had instruments that have very strong legal backing. 37% was moderate, and 9% there was no legal backing at all. When you contrast with the sanitation situation in the next bar, you will see that the sanitation instruments actually had limited backing. You can see 28% of the countries were able to demonstrate that they had strong legal backing. So you can compare 54 and 28, it's almost half. So we can see the sanitation situation in terms of the legal instrument is still lagging behind, and there's work to be done. Then the other graphs just give the regional, the northern all the way to the southern regions. This is a snapshot of the same issue, how strongly the legal system backs the regulations. We can still see differences. You can see some of the countries here in the middle. We have you can see most of the countries that have very strong legal backing for the water regulation instruments are lagging behind in the sanitation backing for the the backing for the sanitation instruments. You can actually see that contrast. So the message that came out is that even the strength of the regulations in place for sanitation are still behind, and there's some catching up to do to the water regulations. Then we also looked at what aspects of the sanitation regulations are in place. Is it covering the sewerage or is it covering the on-site? So we have the graphs which are showing the two. On the left is the sewage sanitation, on the right is the on-site. In the first pair, we have the African situation overall, and then we go to the regional areas. And when you compare the sewage sanitation and the on-site sanitation, we can see on-site sanitation is still behind. Yet we know that most of the sanitation in the continent is actually on-site sanitation as opposed to sewage sanitation. We also explored the models that are used in regulating sanitation. We have the different models that we are familiar with, which is the regulation by agency, where you have a semi-autonomous government body doing the regulation by contract. This is where you have a public utility or the government entering into a contract with a service provider, with a private service provider. Then we also have the model of ministerial regulation. This is where you have a ministry in the country regulating water and sanitation services. Then there's self-regulation, where a utility is providing the service as well as setting its own standards and enforcing them. And there's one region where we had no data. So when you look at the map on the right, you're able to see that regulation by agency is the dark blue. I believe that's what we can all see. The dark blue is where we have the regulation by agency. You can see the areas that had regulation by contract, ministerial, and the self-regulation. In our findings, we saw that about 37% of the countries apply regulation by agency, 28% is by contract, 33% is ministerial, and a small fraction, which is just 2%, are applying self-regulation. So that is the models that are applied in the continent as per the study. And then we were able to identify some key challenges that are encountered in sanitation regulation from our study. We realized that some countries are still prioritizing sewerage regulation over on-site regulation. And then there's also inadequate policy instruments for sanitation regulation. We also identified overlaps in the sanitation mandates. You would find that there are legal instruments in place, but you have different bodies that have the same mandate. So there's that overlap in mandates. Again, there's also inadequate financing. There's an inadequate financial framework. In some of the jurisdictions, we find that the financing for water services, the frameworks that are in place are extensive and are being applicable, but the sanitation sector is still lagging behind, such that the jurisdictions have not explored different ways of financing on-site sanitation. Then, of course, there's a challenge of finding a regulatory framework that fits all, because you would find multiple players in the sector where you have utilities, you have ministries, you have private sector players, small scale, large scale. So finding a regulatory model to fit all of them posed a challenge. But these are things that can be overcome. And then our takeaway from the study in terms of the lessons on sanitation regulation, we're able to identify 5 key ones among others. The role of regulation is key. It cannot be underestimated. Then, of course, the issue of the legal backing for the sanitation instruments is very critical for any system to succeed in effectively regulating sanitation. Then again, there's the need to formalize the sanitation sector, because you realize we have multiple players with different rules, and there's need to formalize and actually have clear guidelines that cover all these players. Then from now, the diversity that we've been able to demonstrate is that there's no one size that fits all in the continent. With the diversity of the jurisdictions, the social systems, the legal systems, We actually have to customize for each of the countries in as much as they're able to benchmark and borrow from each other. And then finally, in terms of sanitation regulation, we looked at the opportunities that we have. You'll acknowledge that we have this growing momentum around regulating on-site sanitation. We have seen good cases that have been presented even by some just before me. We have Rwanda, Zambia, Tanzania, Seychelles, and Senegal, which have made good progress, so we can borrow from them. Then the adoption of the citywide inclusive sanitation models is very critical, and we've seen that this is one opportunity to actually get sanitation into the fold of regulation. Then also there's growing acceptance of on-site sanitation solutions. Most countries have now recognized that on-site sanitation is the solution to the challenge of the very expensive sewerage systems that many have been struggling to finance. And then the legal environment is improving. We can see there are a lot of the jurisdictions that are refining their regulatory instruments to accommodate sanitation regulation. Then finally, we looked at possible accountability mechanisms in the sanitation regulation. We identified about 4 of them. The issue of having formal voluntary oversight structures. These were actually some of the best practices that we're able to pick from the study. Like Zambia has the water watch groups. These are community organizations that have come together, and they oversee the operations of the utilities. And then, of course, the representation in oversight of policy-making institutions. This is where you have members of the public sitting in the decision-making bodies, either in the boards or in the commissions. Then we also have the substantive public consultations. This is where the public are involved in decision-making, be it licensing, tariff setting, review of guidelines, or development of guidelines. This is already being applied in Kenya and Tanzania, where we have the 2 regulators, WASREB and EWURA, actively employing public consultations in all their processes. And then finally, we looked at the use of consumer groups. We have residents associations, consumer protection agencies, which are able to put pressure on the service delivery agents to actually deliver on what the sanitation regulations require. And we also have some very good case examples. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Angela. Now I'm going to try to pivot, if I can, so we can hear from Oscar Pintos. Oscar is there he is. Oscar is the president of ARIRASA. That's it's kind of the opposite number to ESOWAS, but in Latin America. So the Latin America Association of Regulators of Water Supply and Sanitation. This is just a 6-minute video. Unfortunately, Oscar can't be with us today. It's a difficult time of day in Argentina. But I think when we have some questions, we have an Argentinian regulation specialist here with us who... Okay, so here we go.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, on behalf of ARIRASA, I would like to thank the WHO team for the opportunity to participate in this session and share with all of you some concept of sanitation in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll briefly tell you what ARIRASA is. Our association, its scope of coverage in Latin America and the Caribbean. It was created in 2001 and has 17 member countries. The type of regulator is shown in this graphic. We can see that there are different types of regulators, from a single national regulatory agency to countries with subnational regulators. Each country has a sector governance related to its history and its political and institutional development. And this is closely related to the topics of this session. When from a regulatory agency we speak of sanitation, understood as the management of human screening, defined here as feces, urine, and menstrual blood, we tend to think of a public service provided through sanitary sewage networks. This is because historically the regulatory agencies in our region focus their activity on public service, both drinking water and sanitation provided by pipeline networks. In almost all of our countries, there are regulatory frameworks establishing the conditions for their provision. But this is only a part of country sanitations. Areas without network coverage are generally outside of agencies' reach and don't have clear legislation on alternative solutions such as on-site sanitation. For this reason, when we ask who is responsible for sanitation in any countries, we will have two answers. One, well-defined, referring to network service, and another, generally, very diffuse and imprecise, referring to on-site sanitation. This is because in most countries, on-site sanitation is not considered a public service and therefore lacks regulation setting standard of service, tariff, operators' responsibilities, and their control. In many countries, we can find that the Ministry of Health is responsible for using regulations on this kind of sanitations and, in some cases, complemented by local government regulations. But in practice, there is an important gray area regarding responsibilities, especially operation and control. In Argentina, for instance, is not considered public service either, and there is no intervention from Ministry of Health. On-site sanitation activities, transport, treatment, and final disposal, can be carried out by both local government and private sector simultaneously. Something similar occurred in Uruguay and Brazil. Peru and Bolivia consider on-site sanitation as a public service, but only Peru gives regulatory and control powers to the regulators. Summarizing, we find a very wide degree of regulation and responsibilities. Some ones have national regulation, but with little control in practice, and others have regulation establishing the regulatory agency powers in peri-urban areas. For instance, Colombia. It is clear that on-site sanitation is almost an invisible activity. It used not only in rural areas, but also in peri-urban areas. It is not considered a public service mostly. It lacks an effective regulatory framework on the operation and control. It contaminates water reserves due to inadequate management. However, the stage on the on-site sanitation system that could be transformed into a public service are emptying, transport, treatment, and final disposal. This will require a true paradigm shift in sanitation to solve existing problems and to constitute an alternative to close the gap and bring us closer to compliance with SDG 6. Finally, it's necessary to make the problem visible and sensitize stakeholders, putting sanitation on the agenda of policymakers, foster improvement in governance, transforming it into a public service and using regulatory framework, prioritize funding to install the system in place that cannot access network sanitation in a reasonable time. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you all. Okay, so we have heard now from 3 regions. We've heard a bit about the sort of the global picture as well as some information on Eastern Eastern Europe, as well as from SOAS and now Latin America, and I think you can see some themes emerging. We're going to just take around 10 minutes of questions from the audience now before we go into our panel, and hopefully if we have time we can do more questions after the panel. So opening up the floor now, I think although this won't be in the room, the participants online will need it. So any thoughts, questions, queries to our speakers? Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Dennis from Viva Con Agua. Thanks first of all for the presentations. I would have one pretty particular question to the presentation from SOAS, because I was recently conducting some works on the policy framework on sanitation in Tanzania. And what I found there was that a new water and sanitation policy has been passed 2 years ago, 2019. And that policy doesn't include the term on-site sanitation and fecal sludge management at all. But EWURA, the regulator, has passed a guideline saying that their responsibility for on-site sanitation stems from this policy, where I thought it's a very good thing that they have taken up this responsibility. I just wonder, there's, to my understanding, still a gap and room for interpretation. Now, in your policy review, how would you rate that? I mean, it's good when a regulator is already taking up the responsibility, but there's technically, in my understanding, no policy that clearly addresses that.
There are examples where the policy is sufficiently vague that the regulator can kind of move with it. But Angela, would you like to take that one?
Thank you, Eunice, for the question. Yes, indeed. Like we acknowledged, some of our countries still have gaps in their legislation. But like you rightly mentioned, the regulator has moved in to try and plug the gap. But in terms of the legal enforceability, they will need the law. So these are some of the areas where we are talking about the improving legislation to be able to cover these aspects. So that is one challenge that Tanzania will have to overcome. But what we acknowledge is that they have already made steps to cover that gap. Yes, and I think it's for the benefit of the country. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Martin.
Hello, Martin Gambrel. Thanks for 3 excellent presentations. A question for Angela and one for Sam. Sam, if I understood it rightly, you're going to be accompanying these regulators over a period and tracking them, monitoring them. That's a question. A second one is, would it be possible for other countries to join your sort of tracking and monitoring? And for Angela, that was so impressive, that work, and I can ask you afterwards how long it took you and how much it cost, but I won't. I just wondered. I mean, it's a lot of work involved there. I was very intrigued to know how long that took to get that great work together, and whether you're going to be going back and monitoring it in the future.
Shall I go first? Okay. Thank you, Martin. So let me give my response just in conducting this research. So we're working towards an output, which is a paper looking at responsibilities and accountability, including across the European region. The next step is the RegNet annual meeting in November. But I think it's a question for Kate in terms of the prospects of expanding that. But my understanding, absolutely, that's there would be value in that. And what I can say in doing this research is it's very clear that there is a need for enhanced peer-to-peer learning, including in the European region. So I think ongoing support, monitoring, tracking of regulation in that region would be valuable. I can say that in doing the research, but in terms of the mechanisms to support that, I think is maybe a question for Kate.
No, we're absolutely keen to bring new people on and gather more information, particularly to kind of, I think what we would, not just WHO, but I think across the sector, is trying to figure out this kind of roadmap of you going from a situation where you've basically got a Wild West, no regulation of sanitation. How do you kind of move along that roadmap to this kind of ideal of an autonomous regulatory agency? So you obviously can't jump in at that level. And I see that at this moment, there's lots of different actors actually taking interest in regulation, which is fantastic. And I think it is on us to try and coordinate those efforts among different regulatory initiatives that are out there. Yes, back here. Sorry. Yeah. I think you have a mic on, right?
She did it on her own.
Yeah.
Colleague who was actually involved in the mechanics of all this, then he can shed light on the actual work that went into it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Angela, and good morning to everybody. My name is Kasengahara, Executive Secretary of ESAWAS, and I oversaw the assignment. So we projected to undertake the assignment initially in 6 months, but that stretched to almost 9 months, and it costed us quite a lot. So, yeah. So we had quite a lot. I won't disclose, but it was quite a lot. So we had a consultant who then had a team of consultants split into the 5 blocks that you saw over there to superintend over the whole assignment. But what about 9 months? Thanks.
Hello, everybody. This is Tanvir Ahmed. I'm from ITN Buet. We have been involved in forming the regulatory framework for on-site sanitation in Bangladesh. So my specific question would be, in your analysis, it's not only the laws or the regulations can come in different forms, right? It's not only the laws, there are also bylaws, licensing, contracting, all these different bits and pieces. So my first question is, are all these different forms of regulations, when did they go through your analysis? I mean, when you looked at the landscape, regulatory landscape of all these different things. The second question is that sometimes these regulations are devised in a way that is very central. That means the national government, sorry, the national government basically, these laws are, they are promulgated. Sometimes it's not known to all the stakeholders, although the country has a law on on-site sanitation. So was there any assessment whether or not, if there is a national law, but the law is not known to the local level like the municipality or something, did that assessment go into your analysis? Thank you.
Sam, Angela, Kasenga, would one of you like to attempt that one?
Good delegation.
Yeah.
That's delegated management.
Do you want to have a go? Okay.
So the question is that these regulations can come in different forms. Like, one is a national law, sometimes there are bylaws, sometimes there are licensing, sometimes these are just government orders, like a SRO or something, a statement from the ministry or something. So in your analysis, when you looked at the regulatory landscape, did you take into consideration all these different documents, or just you considered only the national laws which are like passed in the parliament or something?
Thanks again for the question. So obviously Africa is very diverse, different political systems, I emphasize, and therefore the manner in which laws are passed is different. Give an example, Mozambique, Angola will use decrees, right? The other countries will use statutory instruments, they will use the formal legislative process to parliament, and it becomes a national law. So we essentially looked at the national law and the decrees where they were applicable in those countries. But I know that there are also countries like Zambia that are using statutory instruments to try and enforce sanitation regulation. But basically we're looking at the national picture. So I hope that's answered. Thanks.
Of time, I think we're going to transition to our panel, but just picking up on Kasenga's point about what a in-depth and money spent on that amazing landscape assessment. Before you go commissioning any work on regulation in Africa, have a look and see whether it's already in that landscape assessment. Okay, if we could call on our panelists now, and I'm going to hand over to Sam, who will moderate. No, you don't need that one actually, you've got a thing. Yes, and hopefully we can get our online speakers there. We can get rid of that. We're all a bit new to this hybrid, so please bear with us. Are you able to help us bring up the online speakers? In the meantime, Gustavo, if you could come and take a seat up here, and Kasenga. Yes, Angela, why don't you come up as well? I think Richard is also joining online, but if you take a seat, if you don't mind. We'll give you to the microphone to share, if that's okay. And yep.
Okay. Well, mindful of the time because we've just got around 30 minutes, and frankly, a spectacular panel, and we want to hear from all of them. So I think let's move into it. So we're trying to bring up the online speakers, but in person, we've got Gustavo Saltiel, Global Lead for Water Supply and Sanitation, the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. Kisenga, of course, who you've heard from SOAS and also from NOASCO, and Angela from WASREB, and hopefully we'll bring up our online speakers in just a moment. Just a point on housekeeping for our speakers, because we want to hear from all of you. So we're going to be strict in timekeeping. So if I can ask you just to keep your initial responses to around 3 minutes, and I'll let you know when we're at 3 minutes. I know that's going to be a challenge, but let's see how we go. So maybe Gustavo, we can start with you. So we've seen that regulation of on-site sanitation requires particular attention, and the bank has released multiple papers in this area, a working paper on regulation. You've also just released a paper on PIR. So it would be...
Just going to move your microphone a little bit.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So it'd be really fascinating to hear what the bank has learned about supporting clarity of regulation for on-site sanitation.
Okay. Can you hear me? It's on? On? Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thanks, Sam, for the introduction, Kate, for the invitation. Thanks also to the speakers, Sam, Oscar, and Angela, for excellent presentations. I think, in a way, they have already responded to part of your question, at least, but I'll try to summarize. Yes, indeed, yesterday, the World Bank launched what we call the PIR report, which PIR stands for Policies, Institutions, and Regulation. And this report condenses experiences gathered by the World Bank through our own operations in more than 20 countries. We initially developed a framework for PIR in 2017. Then we applied it in a series of clients of the World Bank. And clients are those countries that borrow from the World Bank. So for us, it's a fantastic opportunity to learn, and came out with this new report that draws the analysis, but also proposes adapting PIR structures to the emerging challenges of climate change, digitalization, water scarcity, wastewater reuse, etc. So one of the first point I'd like to make is the following. And I noted in some of the presentations, in particular the work done by SOAS, the connections between regulation and policies. But I would like to strengthen that it will be challenging to advance significantly in establishing the mandates in terms of accountability and regulation of service providers, be it sewage systems or on-site, if we do not address the other dimensions of PIR in a comprehensive manner. One of the lessons learned, including from our own work, the World Bank, through the years we have supported reforms in countries that looked at one or two of those dimensions. We worked a lot on institutional reform, without looking at the enabling environment or financing policies or regulatory structures. Or we supported the creation of regulators or regulation by contract without looking at the institutional architecture. So the first message is look at policies, institutions, and regulation in a comprehensive and consistent manner. Otherwise, the results may be suboptimal. Second message, and please cut me when my 3 minutes are 1 more minute, okay. So second message is that, and again very important, is to be patient. Reforms and changing institutional and political structures take time. And I'm again talking from the side of the World Bank experience. Oftentimes, our goal is to support our clients in reforming the sector during the lifetime of a World Bank project, 5 years. It doesn't happen. Or it may happen because there are resources or TA or requirements, even legal covenants to create an organization, create a regulator. That's a condition for disbursement. Once the project is closed, that regulator dies. So, we need to understand, I think, development institutions in general, is that you have to be patient. There are ups and downs, there are failures, and in an ideal world, development partners and IFIs should accompany countries throughout the reform process. And that may take 20 years. And I would like to mention the example of Colombia. Oscar Pinto presented very well the experience of Aderasa in Latin America. Colombia, CRA, the regulator of Colombia, in our view, is an excellent example. And I will not say, as Angela rightly highlighted, we shouldn't talk about best practice any longer, and that is a lesson learned also from the past. Cookie-cutter approaches do not work, and therefore I'm not saying that CRA Colombia is best practice, but it's a very interesting example that demonstrates the evolution of the regulatory process. It started 25 years ago, consolidating the performance of service providers at the municipal level. So national regulators supporting and national government supporting services at the subnational level, and little by little further consolidated over 20 years, moving to performance-based regulation. And currently, CRA Colombia is looking at the emerging issues of regulation, including on scarcity, climate change, resilience, technology, digitalization, and above all, risk-based regulation. But it took them 25 years. We need to understand that. To conclude, so I really welcome the presence of Aderasa by video, but Esawas here, because also, and with IWA, and I think Carlos Diaz will speak shortly, supporting this network of regulators and supporting South-South experiences. And in a delegation from Esawas is about to travel, supported by the World Bank, to Latin America to learn from these experiences, and also the opportunity to understand how regulation in Latin America is adapting to the urbanization of the continent, which may be an interesting lesson for Africa. Thank you.
Hear them. So first of all, we have Christian Walder, who's water supply and sanitation specialist with the Asian Development Bank. So Christian, can you hear me?
Hello, a very good afternoon from Manila. Yes, and now I can hear you.
Great, okay. Thank you, Christian. So building on Gustavo's contribution, and given that IFIs can play such a critical role in supporting processes of institutional reform, it'd be great to hear your perspective on how ADB, through its investments in the Asia-Pacific region, can help clarify responsibilities for regulating sanitation, but also an important point that featured in the SDG accelerators, how can investments from ADB and other IFIs help build the capacity of regulators?
Thank you very much, Sam. And again, it's great to be with you today. Thank you for having me on this panel. And I fully agree that international financing institutions can play a critical role in supporting processes of institutional and regulatory reforms. Well, I would like to mention 3 aspects that we at the Asian Development Bank are using widely in our projects and programs. First, obviously, I would like to touch upon the point of different lending modalities. Yeah, I think it's obvious that standalone project loans are still the dominating financing modality of our sovereign lending, but we see a significant increase of other lending modalities in recent years. And these are, for example, policy-based loans, results-based loans, particularly also sector loans and sector development programs. And let me quickly explain what we understand as a sector development program. This basically combines policy-based lending with an investment loan. So responding to occasions where a country has both an investment requirement and a need for policy reform in a given sector, for example, sanitation sector. And we have seen in many countries where we're working that those sector development programs have proved to be quite successful. And I want to touch upon the point that Gustavo was making. I think the most successful stories we had where we have a long-term relationship with our partners and clients, citing an example from Nepal, where we have worked together with our partners there for more than 20 years and invested more than $1 billion USD for developing water supply and sanitation infrastructure in small towns across the entire country. And this is really the relationship that is required for reforming also the institutions in the country. Luckily, within the ADB, we have a track record of more than 50 years. So we have good relationships with our clients and partners, and this really helps. But also applying those different lending modalities is, I would not say carrot and stick approach, but at least have a kind of incentivized approach when putting projects and programs together. The second point I would like to mention, and it has been already cited in the discussion, is the role of technical assistance. Yeah, in ADB we have a comprehensive budget in terms of technical assistance, and for example, between 2011 until 2021, we have invested more than 500 million in technical assistance, both for project preparation and knowledge and support and capacity building. Specifically, the knowledge and support TAs, they focus on capacity, providing policy advice, undertaking research and development. And I think this is a very powerful instrument when working together with clients and partners. But again, you know, it needs this patience that has been mentioned before. It needs this long-term approach and also the integrated perspective in terms of looking into policies, institutions, and regulatory aspects. And this is also what we try to promote within the Asian Development Bank. Last but not least, and then I stop, I would also like to mention the convening power that organizations such as the Asian Development Bank and other IFIs have to bring together different stakeholders and partners. You know, we can act as a platform, and this has proved to be effective when collaborating with different stakeholders in the sanitation sector. You know, when, for example, having different service providers for centralized sanitation systems, on-site sanitation systems, examples from Bangladesh, I think we all know them. We have seen that IFIs and other organizations can play a critical role in bringing together the different stakeholders and to push the necessary reforms. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christian. Hope you can hear the applause in the room. So again, some really clear points coming out of that. You've talked about sector development programs, the critical importance of technical assistance over the long term, and quite right, I think, to highlight the convening power of ADB and other IFIs. I wanted to now bring in Kasenga, if I may. It's always a privilege to have Kasenga on the panel because he has two hats in his role as with NOASCO and also with SOAS. And we've heard about the need for long-term improvements in PIR. We mentioned through the presentation Zambia as an example where there's been really notable improvements in the regulatory framework. With your SOS hat, but you can also draw from NOASCO if you like, interesting to hear any other examples you would highlight from the Eastern and Southern Africa region of countries that are making progress towards clarifying responsibilities for sanitation regulation and what lessons we might learn from those countries.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the question. Actually, this journey began sometime in 2017 when we realized that none or almost all of us did not have actually a mandate for non-sewerage sanitation. We're all focusing on sewerage services. And if you look at the benchmarking reports that you refer to, most of the indicators in there were inclined to sewerage services. So we did a gap analysis right about 2018, 2019 in our region. This was not across the whole continent, but only in our region, to look at what the gaps were regarding non-sewerage sanitation. And there were many. Countries were at different levels. A country like Zambia did already cite sanitation as both being sewered and non-sewered in the law, but there were other countries that were not very clear, other countries none at all. So I'll give an example of Lesotho. where there's a mandate for sewerage services, but the regulator actually has got no regulatory power to regulate non-sewage sanitation. So from there, we developed regulatory frameworks that the countries have now adapted or adopted, and a little bit of service provision models included to those frameworks. And this is what we've been following as ECOWAS countries. So we are on different paths, but there are countries like Burundi that are making very considerable progress. They're going through reform processes, clarifying the mandates, the responsibilities, and so on. And also countries that are a little lagging behind, but they're making steady progress. A country like Lesotho that I've just given an example of. Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania have made significant progress, as you've heard, and these are countries that we're using for peer reviews or peer-to-peer learning by the other countries in the region. So one of the reasons actually we did the landscape study was also to facilitate cross-regional learning, apart from cross-country learning from the countries that have made progress. So I hope those are sufficient examples. There are lots I can give. Angola, Mozambique, still reforming, even to ride on the point that Gustavo has mentioned. Mozambique is transitioning the regulator. It's called CRA. I can't give the full names in Portuguese, but they're now transitioning into an authority, so it could have much more power, right, to regulate. So many things happening, but I think we're on the right path in terms of reforming our sectors. Thank you.
You've referenced there Kenya as one example that features prominently in peer-to-peer learning, and so I'd like to bring in Richard Cheriot. We should have Richard on the line. Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, Sam, I can hear you.
Great. Director Monitoring and Enforcement with WASREB. So, Richard, we've seen that WASREB is involved in regulation across the on-site and sewage sanitation chains. I'd like to bring us from this question around responsibilities towards accountability. It would be interesting to hear from you some of the key accountability mechanisms that WASREB is seeking to apply to ensure service providers are accountable for executing their mandate.
Thank you very much, Sam, and it's also a pleasure for us to be part of this discussion this afternoon, I guess. Greetings from Nairobi to everyone. So what have we done? But I think before I do that, I think I want to put a bit of context to this whole discussion. We have seen the landscape study that was presented by Angela, and I guess if you looked at the Eastern Bloc and specifically Kenya, then you will likely realize that we were colored green. That basically tells us that if you look at the mandate for regulation, then basically we are saying we are rated high. But that is not to say that we don't have issues. WASREB has been in existence now for close to getting to 20 years, and our mandate basically is regulation of water and water services. And if you look at the law, the way it's crafted, then that mandate basically talks to water and sewerage services. But just like the case that was highlighted, subsequently, we have seen policy changes that have actually pushed that to include the non-sewage sanitation. But just to speak to what we are saying in terms of what have we done in terms of service provision to really ensure that the service providers that we have are accountable in terms of sanitation services provision. For us, the entry point and the key is the licensing process. And I think, Sam, you mentioned this in your study, that, the utilities that we have, and currently we have about 90 of this that serve a population of close to 50% of the national population. The licensing process for us does afford us an opportunity to be able to really entreat accountability to the water service providers in terms of sanitation services provision. So in the license that utilities are given, it's very clear as to the mandate that they have in terms of sanitation services. The license further has even targets that utilities have to meet for the period of the license towards improving access to sanitation services provision. Of course, we do appreciate that we also have a role in terms of setting tariffs for the utilities. And one of the aspects that we have really gone into is to disaggregate tariffs for water and sanitation services, ensuring that there's cost accounting for the two services. This basically ensures that as utilities implement the activities, it's very clear as to the extent of what they are supposed to do in respect of sanitation services. What the policy documents basically have gone ahead to elaborate is really ensure that we have both focus to off-site and on-site sanitation issues. So we do appreciate that to be able to get to both the national targets that we have, the SDG targets, then the focus has really moved from off-site services alone and really include utilities focusing on site sanitation issues. So we do have in the tariff process now focus to ensure that utilities are pushed to putting efforts in terms of non-sewer sanitation services and generally also the whole issue around sanitation services. The other aspect that we have as well.
Sorry, Richard, but you're at time. If you can just wrap up, just one more minute, thanks.
Yeah, I think the other thing is around what you've just mentioned, Sam, around reporting and benchmarking for the water for the utilities. We do on an annual basis really produce a report that benchmarks the performance of water service providers in respect of the different areas of the operations, and this includes aspects of sanitation services. So I think in a nutshell, we have a lot of initiatives that really ensure that utilities are accountable in terms of the services that they are giving. But I think in closing, really, a critical issue that one needs to look at is really that enabling and environment aspect that utilities have to have a clear mandate for what they do, and of course subsequently then ensure that they are held accountable for what they do. And because it's very clear that resources really follow functions, it goes without saying that once you have a clear mandate, then financing would be structured as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. So yeah, really useful to reiterate that point that mandates are really the foundation, clear responsibilities are the starting point in terms of then building accountability. And you've mentioned a number of mechanisms there around tariff setting, around benchmarking, and others that WASREB is implementing very effectively. So fantastic to hear from you. Thank you. Just staying with regulators and with WASREB, I'd like to bring in Angela. We talked about data management and how that really has a critical role to play in this addressing this issue. Can you share the experience of the Kenyan sector, because it's really one of the leading sectors, I think, in this area, around developing robust regulatory monitoring systems, and perhaps connected to that, what advice would you give other countries who are perhaps at an earlier stage in developing robust data management systems?
Thank you, Sam. I believe my mic is still on. In Kenya, we have a system where we actually have annual reports. Currently, we have the 14th report that we've released on an annual basis, and this report is basically a performance report of the water and the sanitation sector. Like my colleague Richard has rightly put it, is that initially we started off with water and sewerage only, but with time we have now adopted sanitation. So what we have done is that every year we collect data on allow me to talk of it, what we've actually done. It's on the water and the sewerage system initially. So we would report on the coverage, the water and sanitation quality issues. We would report on other key performance indicators that we've all adopted. And what we have done is that we have increasingly pulled in the water service providers. Like he mentioned, we have about 90. But when you look at the first report that we reported on, we barely had 30 of them. but over time we're able to bring in the other water service providers. And one of the incentives that we used was that we recognized good performers. We find that any water service provider that is outstanding in one of the key performance indicators that we assess would actually get recognition and a prize and a certificate for it. And this motivated other water service providers in reporting. In addition, we built the capacity of the water service providers to be able to report on this information that we were seeking. We would hold training sessions, and when we adopted an electronic system for collecting the data, we trained them on it. We would sometimes go out with laptops to the remote areas where they did not have computers, just a way of building their capacity and bringing them in. And also we would arrange for such companies to actually get access to the IT equipment and be able to report on it. Again, we also made sure that it is a very predictable cycle. Every water service provider in the country knows that come 30th September, WASREB is going to send out a data request with all the requirements. And this has helped the water service providers to organize themselves around the cycle. So the issue of motivation through incentives, the issue of capacity building, the recognition, like I've said, and also the WASREB team going out and just bringing in the water service providers has really helped. In terms of data management, yes, we have grappled with data quality issues, but it has improved over time. The initial not very acceptable data that we began with did not discourage us. We tried to help the water service providers to improve on how they keep their data so as to be able to report on a quarterly and annual basis. And this has helped us to be able to monitor the water and sanitation situation. And we believe that even now, as we have taken on on-site sanitation, we are also going to apply the same mechanism so that we're able to give reliable data on on-site sanitation as well as the off-site. Thank you.
Thank you. Extremely impressive, the monitoring system that WASREB has created, and I think you get a sense of the scale of effort that has been put into that, including capacity development, and I think it's really useful that you've mentioned rewarding good performance, because it's easy looking at regulation to focus on sanctions and penalties, but actually rewarding good performance is a really powerful incentive. So moving online, hoping now to bring in Juliet Willits, who's Research Director and Professor at University of Technology, Sydney. So Juliet, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me okay?
Great, thank you. Fantastic to have you with us. So there's a need to strengthen the evidence base around what works in sanitation regulation. And it came out somewhat in the presentations, but enforcement is a particularly challenging area. UTS and also SNV have worked together on research around smart enforcement and how that can be approached. So it would be really interesting to hear from you, what do you see as some of the ways forward around enforcement? And connected to that also, what are wider research priorities that you would perceive in this area of sanitation regulation?
Sure, thanks, Sam, and I hope I can be heard. It's very strange to do this in a webinar and then in a room where you can't be seen. I'll try and keep it brief. So the work we did on smart enforcement was really about how do you use your very limited resources for maximum impact when you're looking at enforcement. And the findings we came up with was that you needed a range of measures, which is something we've heard about from other speakers as well, that it's not just about top-down penalty mechanisms or bottom-up communication, but that you need a mix. And whether that's to do with construction standards for septic tanks, or whether it's about emptying practices and service providers, these types of principles apply. And what we found was that responsive regulation, where you're trying to understand reasons why people don't comply with a regulation, that might be intentional, but also might be not intentional. And if you understand those attitudes of the different target segments, then you can match your enforcement approach to the group. Secondly, also understanding the motivations and constraints of the different stakeholders that you're regulating, trying to make it easier for them to comply rather than applying strict punitive measures as a first response. And finally, a last part was about, if you want an enforcement system to be legitimate, really you have to have a monitoring system. There has to be some way to know if there's non-compliant activity, and that can be hugely costly if you don't design it well. But methods like random inspections, or we heard Angela, she mentioned community-based groups, citizen reporting. There are many different ways that we can actually think about how to monitor and be a little bit more creative in who we involve in those systems to make sure monitoring happens. So moving to your second question, which was about wider research priorities. I mean, first of all, let's just do more research. Let's do more studies like what Sam and Angela presented. If you look at the 3IE evidence map for water and sanitation, you find that it's actually empty for rigorous evidence on legal reform. And I think that's a real shame. It's such an important area, as everyone has highlighted in this session. We need stronger methods. We need more research in this area. And I think in terms of defining an agenda, we need to first ask the public sector agencies in the many countries about their questions, their dilemmas, and what questions they need answers to. And as has been said earlier today, we need to have a starting point of the legal context and who's responsible for what and what is the enabling environment. And once we're past that and looking at the actual regulations themselves, studies that look at, before we decide on a regulatory measure, what's its feasibility, what net benefit will it give, what impacts will it have, actually doing more rigorous study before we roll out regulation, and also after the fact, better regulatory impact assessment. And there are lots of standard methods for looking at that, looking at the stages of the actual implementation, the behaviour change, and whether or not you're actually achieving the outcomes you want. So I think, you know, research in any of those areas could go a long way to improving regulation and accountability in the sector. Thanks, Sam, and over back to you.
You can hear applause in the room. So we did hear you throughout, and we do recommend the SNV and University of Technology Sydney, the Institute for Sustainable Futures, their paper on smart enforcement, because it's a really thorny area, and you know, Juliet's provided some really clear guidance there around understanding motivations, around monitoring, as well as a plea for more research, which we would completely agree with. Okay, so finally, last contribution, I'd like to bring in Carlos Diaz. Carlos, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Can you hear me? Hello?
I'm an engagement manager with IWA. So Carlos, IWA recently put out a call to action on regulating on-site sanitation, rooted in the Lisbon Charter. You have a regulators forum coming up in September as well. To round this up, it would be really interesting to hear your views on priority areas where we can get traction around this question of clarifying responsibilities for regulation, and connected to that, where is IWA focusing its efforts right now?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to start reflecting on the words of my colleagues, for instance, Gustavo, that mentioned that it's very important to build up on the previous experiences, right? And the experiences of our colleagues, because these things takes a lot of time, right? For instance, something I can refer to is, maybe Gustavo didn't want to talk about this, but in the presentation of Aderasa, our colleague Oscar told us that in Peru, I am from Peru, by the way, in Peru, on-site sanitation is recognized in the law, and I am not pretty sure if it is something like that, but the reality is that the regulator was created there to supervise the 50 big utilities, right? The 50 main utilities, actual companies, municipal public companies, but companies, right, with their separate accounts, etc. And now, because of a project of the bank, with the support of the bank on a project, as Gustavo said, 5-year project, we managed to push for a reform, a law, the modernization law. And as a result of that, now the regulator is obliged to supervise the 50 big companies, the 400 something small municipal water service providers, municipal unit, and the rural sector, right? That is mainly provided by communal systems. That, by the way, then you have difficulties, right? Because if these people are volunteering to provide this work and you are going to regulate it, maybe they tell you, okay, here is a job, no? You can do it by yourself, right? Because it's a regulatory, it's a completely voluntary job. So building up on the experience is quite important. For instance, in the case of IWA, we started in 2013 or 15, trying to clarify concepts, trying to make everyone to speak the same language, and that is why we launched with this Lisbon Charter, that is nothing more than some principles for public policy and regulation, some what are the most common responsibilities of governments, regulators, service providers, users, and what would be the principles for effective regulatory framework, right? Because as you know, most of these frameworks are built in context, are contextualized by history, by culture, by the colonial power that control your territories in the past, you know, that have much more impact than the reforms that you are trying to incorporate in 3 or 4 years, right? And built on the Lisbon Charter, then we have this project, 1-year project, Regulator for Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, focus on regulators. And if you look for the lessons learned in the IWA website, lessons learned regulating for citywide inclusive sanitations, you will find a lot of information, but in a nutshell, I will tell you that what we observe, well, I am new in IWA, but what we observe is that regulators were very much focused on their mandates. That is not a mystery, of course. They were very focused on regulating established sewer systems, because that was a reality. But we also observed that they were not, or they maybe because they were very focused on their mandates and the limited resources that they had, they were not really keen, or they were not actually pushing for make any change, right? And that is why now, building up, now we have a next phase. We will have a next project named Inclusive Urban Sanitation that we are going to launch in Copenhagen at the IWA World Water Congress, where we are going to continue engaging and discussing not only with regulators, but all the other players in the sector, right? Mayors, utilities, ministry officials, policymakers, because yes, because as we know, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to make any progress on this. Yes, I think my time is out.
I'm sorry, that felt somewhat abrupt, but I'm just mindful that we have closing remarks to come. So I'm really sorry to draw that to a close, but some may need to leave. So thank you so much, Carlos, for sharing those reflections, and also linking to the IWA Congress in Copenhagen in September, which of course will be another opportunity to discuss some of these issues. So I'd like to hand back to Kate for closing remarks.
I'll keep it quick. In fact, our closing remarks are going to be from the Gates Foundation. It's 3 a.m. in Seattle, and Elise has rightly so gone to bed. So, but apologies. We'd hoped this would be a little bit more of an audio-visual experience. Unfortunately, Zoom has crashed. So thank you all very much for sticking with us. There's, I hope you would have found some real nuggets in there. We've got this is such an exciting field. Yes, Kasinga's got a comment.
I just wanted to make one final announcement. The work that we've been doing on the landscape, we're still interrogating it further. And you are welcome to making submissions. We have a conference in Zanzibar between the 14th and 19th of November, where we hope to chart a way forward in terms of the work and the outputs that are in the report. But please visit the website www.eswas.org, and you can have a good read there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And hopefully at the end of that you notice the date, 19 November. That's going to be World Toilet Day. I think it's an excellent opportunity to amplify all of these messages. And if I could have, I would have shown you the new logo we're putting out, which is a countdown to 2030 for sanitation. So launching, we've got 7 years till the SDGs are finished, so I'd really love if all of your organisations just spray that around and remind us that we're the most lagging SDG and there's a lot to be done. Thank you all, have a great conference and enjoy your lunch. So frustrating with the audio visual, thank you, you were a champ.